by the White Star Line. They had to re-pour the concrete because people started taking little pieces of it as souvenirs. So folks actually would have been buried in front of their tombstones. I was going to point out Ernest Edward Samuel Freeman. He was, I have to look at his title because he worked for Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line. He was chief deck steward, and Bruce Ismay took a lot of heat because he boarded the lifeboat, and folks say he saved himself. So the rest of his life was very, very difficult. So many of the men that survived on the Titanic went on to have a very difficult time because they said they shouldn't have saved themselves. But you did need people in the rowboats that were capable of rowing. And in many cases, they tried to encourage the men to get in so that the ladies would board with the children. So they paid a little bit more for this stone, so that's why it's bigger than the stone next door. I think you have the 2-year-old child, but the crew were very, very young. I wrote down some of their ages here. For instance, Ernest Price, up at the top here, he was only 17, and his tombstone number is 186. So he was the 186th body recovered. We'll walk up a bit.
Revisit the information and then come up with the name Sydney Leslie Goodwin.
Right.
And in 2012, the Museum of Atlantic said, yes, this is Sydney Leslie Goodwin, and put the plaque here for them. And they left the stone the way it is for all the other unknown
buildings. So Ernest Price was only 17. Okay. I think that's so sad, don't you think? Yeah. And Alma Paulson, we always hoped that Gosta was buried at her feet. But as I mentioned on board the motor coach, it turned out to be Sidney Goodwin. He was traveling, he had, it was a family of 6 children with his parents, and his body was the only one recovered. And what's interesting is when they were able to identify him through DNA, the family came and held a service here for their beloved family member who died all those years ago. So it's very interesting. But Alma Paulson made quite an impact because of, they said, how strong she was to stay and play the harmonica to soothe her children. J.W. Marriott, he was a pantryman on board, not related to the hotel line of Marriott's. So often folks will ask me, why would he be buried here? He was a crew member. The crew members were somewhat easy to identify because, of course, a coal stoker or fireman on board, they would be shoving the coal into the engines. They were often covered in coal, and they had a coal stoker's uniform. The band members wearing their band uniform. The waiters that were recovered were wearing their wait staff costumes. I'll point out on our way out, Luigi Gatti, he actually owned the a la carte dining room on board the Titanic. He had, I think, 66 staff members on board because they were independent of the White Star Line, and he was a very well-known restaurateur, had restaurants in some big cities in Europe, and also had the first-class dining room on the Olympic. But I think only 2 of his staff members survived who were cashiers, female cashiers. The men all went down, and only some of their bodies were recovered. So we'll walk around and we'll have a look at the tomb of the unknown child. So someone put a picture of Sidney Goodwin here, so this kind of makes it even more sad, doesn't it? So folks leave little bits of memorabilia to honor Sidney. But the crew members acted as the unknown child's pallbearers. And quite a collection of people came when they had the service. I think it was May 12th, because of course it took time to get the bodies into Halifax and to have, you know, the stones and the service. And the last service was held here on June 12th, 1912. They have tried to identify many of the unknown victims through time, and you'll see we'll find a fairly large number behind me here. But they may have a good idea who they are, but not a definitive answer. And of course, the DNA studies are becoming more and more difficult because this area is on a slope, and you have, of course, water runoff. And the only reason they were able to identify the unknown child is that breastplate that protected the bone. And a Halifax police sergeant was given the task of taking all of the clothes from the Titanic victims and burning them in a bonfire. I don't know why they did that, but they did. He took Sidney Goodwin's shoes home with him because he couldn't bear the thought of putting these little shoes in the bonfire. And the shoes also helped identify Sidney Goodwin. So it's kind of interesting how something like that would help in the future and why they would burn all the clothes. But they did catalog all the information. The body, like I said, it was given a number, and then they would say, if you found identifying papers, they would know who it is, but they'd still say your height, your weight, you know, a male with whatever tattoos you might have, what you were wearing, what possessions you had on your person when your body was recovered. So I'm not sure why William Harrison, being a first-class passenger, why his family decided he should stay, but some people do believe, you know, they didn't want to move the body. So this is the only first-class passenger buried here at Fairview Lawn. And we'll move down a bit. I had to look up his age because he was one of the older gentlemen buried here. He was 40 years of age. So young, really. John Lockhew, 193, the violinist on board. I believe it was his violin that was recently sold in an auction. I'm not sure if you follow Titanic memorabilia, but it sold for vast sums of money. And I believe the violin was taken home to his family and then ended up in auction not too long ago. But this is a gentleman that the family received the bill for his band costume. So very sad. I hope they never paid it, but I'm not sure. So here you'll find the unidentified. And I made little notes next to them because, for instance, 257, he was wearing a boiler suit. He was in the engineering department. They know a rough idea of his age. They have a description. But you have to remember that the crew members on the Titanic came from all across Europe. And, of course, you had communication issues, language barriers. So it was very difficult. And many families were very poor. They couldn't afford to have a family member come and identify their loved one in Halifax. So that, of course, contributed to the fact that they have so many unidentified here at Fairview Lawn. Now, Alan Vincent Franklin, when they first buried him, they weren't sure who he was. His body was identified, so his name is on the front of the stone versus being on the top. He was identified in 1912, but just a little bit later on. So that's why his name is on the side of his tomb. The unsinkable Molly Brown came to Halifax and laid wreaths here at Fairview Lawn because, of course, Molly Brown survived. She was never known as Molly in life, always Margaret. Made their money in the gold rush. We're going to walk up into this aisle here. They did DNA studies on 281, but couldn't come up with a definitive answer as to who 281 is. And they gave this person a rough age of, as a female, of 30 years of age. Okay. Number 330, James McCready. This was, actually you'll find gaps in the numbers because remember they did sea burials. They also didn't use every single number. There's a gap here at, I think around, it might have been 324, you know, that vicinity. But James McCready was the last body recovered and brought to Halifax. So even though he's 330, you know, the numbers went a bit higher, but he was the last body recovered. I'm pointing out Joseph Dawson's grave, not Jack Dawson, number 227. That's another tombstone that people are very interested in. People always say, where's Rose? Where does she live these days? There's no Rose. That was fiction made up by James Cameron, the Canadian, who filmed the movie Titanic. No. Yes, their bodies were viewed here. We're actually walking on their bodies. Yes. Every person. Now, it was absolute confusion. You may wonder, why aren't the numbers in numerical sequence? That's because they had so many bodies, so little time, and each person was buried in front of their tombstone. So can you imagine the time that that would take in 1912? So it was a phenomenal task. And they also were burying over at Mount Olivet and up at Baron de Hirsch. So not too much would be left of these poor Titanic victims because, of course, Mother Nature has run her course. So ashes to ashes, dust to dust. But indeed, they were buried, and these are the original stones. And many, many folks in Halifax came to attend the services, and many of our churches held services, even for bodies that were not recovered. Like there was only one millionaire from Halifax, but by the name of Mr. George Wright. His body was not recovered, but they had a service at St. Paul's Anglican Church in Halifax to honor his memory. He was very philanthropic. He just had built a gorgeous mansion in Halifax, and luckily he made out his will. He bequeathed it to the Women's Council. The women were responsible for the Victorian Order of Nurses and playdowns for children, run by the Countess originally of Aberdeen. And the house today is still used for good works, to raise money for charities, etc. So throughout Halifax, they would have had services. They would have tolled the bells. They asked the folks in Halifax not to go down to the pier and try to observe the bodies being brought in, as it was such a sad event. And folks in Halifax did listen. There's very few pictures taken of when the bodies did arrive. So, any other questions? I'm going to point out one more tombstone. Everybody, no questions?
Where the Jewish...
The Jewish are at the top, but the Jewish cemetery, Baron de Hirsch, is not open. They have a different philosophy when it comes to cemeteries, and so it's only open for family members to come. One of the bodies buried at Baron de Hirsch is Michael Navratil. Michael Navratil was traveling under the assumed name of Hoffman. He was divorcing his wife, had taken his 2 young children, and planned on coming into New York. When the Titanic was going down, he gave Michelle and Edmund, his 2 sons, to ladies on a lifeboat and said, please look after my sons and tell my wife I'm sorry. So the 2 children arrived in New York, and they had the headlines in the papers. Orphan children arrive in New York. Their mother, I think perhaps might have been Italy, was told of the headline, went to Italy to recover her sons who survived the Titanic, Edmund and Michelle. And one of my good friends, a fellow tour guide, had the honor of bringing Edmund Navratil to Halifax and taking him to his father's tombstone in 1996. So I thought that was very memorable. Right. I'll point out Luigi Gatti, the owner of the first class dining room.
What was the name of the little plane?
Oh, John Law Hume. We have 2 band members buried, one at Mount Olivet and one here at Dorothy Vaughan. Of the band, that was John Law Hume.
Is he here?
Yes. Oh yes, he's in the last row.
Oh, okay.
Let's see how many stones down. I'll just tell you here. 7th stone down. Nope, the last row over there. John Law Hume was only 21 years of age too. So sad, isn't it? Luigi Gatti. So he would have been a pretty affluent fellow, but he was treated as a crew member. So that's kind of sad as well. Also, the Celtic cross behind you, that was paid for by the family because they were very sad, the McRae family, and he was traveling 2nd class. And Arthur Gordon McRae was only 32 years of age. So if you want to know any of the ages, I've researched the folks buried here. I have their age and their occupation, and the unknowns, who they think they might be. So very interesting.
Did they establish this cemetery as part of that, or was it already established?
It was already established. In fact, they're still burying here today. So it's kind of interesting. This is still an active cemetery. I believe it opened in, I think it says on the placard, it was in the 1800s. We'll have a look at the plaque.